All right. While we wait for a couple more people to join, I'll just say hi to everyone. In the meantime, just one second. All right. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Nama. As you might know, if you recognize the building in the background, I'm from KUDC in KU. Here to lecture today about engagement. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about how I view engagements in terms of implicit and explicit engagement. I'll be sharing my screen momentarily, and this will also be shared later, I believe, on the KIDA channel YouTube. So, you know, if you want a copy of this lecture file, you will be able to get it when you like watch it. Maybe I'll even send the link to the secretariat since I think that would make everything a little bit easier. Alrighty. Assuming, all right, I think my screen is very visible. Okay. Okay. Before getting into this, if anyone has any questions during the lecture, feel free to like interrupt me whenever. You can use the raise hand function or just unmute. I am really unfazed. Like as a debater, I'm used to people interrupting me with like, POIs or whatnot. So consider that the same thing, especially relevant in a lecture about engagement. If you have questions that you want to ask through chat, you can send that as well, but I will probably only get to them at the end of the lecture because like obviously it would be kind of like disruptive to take time to read a question and then answer it. All right, so the topic today is implicit and explicit engagement. This lecture is mainly for rookies who are feeling lost with engagement, not knowing how to approach it or how to improve it or even what it is in general. People who are typically the case builders who are looking to diversify their contributions beyond just like building arguments, wanting to also be able to contribute in other ways to their team. So for instance, if you feel like you're only ever running positive material and you feel like the other team is just very well responsive to you, then you might want to diversify the ways that you're trying to win. And any other debaters who get comments about things like you're lacking engagement and so on and so forth, which is something that I used to get a lot more as a rookie than I do right now. I will say that there are a couple of caveats before I get into this. The first is that most of this is how I view engagement. Probably you would each approach this with your own debate styles. I think that is a very good and beautiful thing that you should be engaging in the ways that you feel best doing. But I find that these are the strategic perspectives that are most beneficial to me. And as such, I wanted to pass this on to people in KIDA and to whoever watches this later on YouTube. All right, so in this lecture, I'm going to cover what is engagement and why does it matter. We'll look at some types and examples of this, how you can pull off explicit engagement, how you incorporate implicit engagement into your speech, and then we'll have like a short finding your own strength in engagement tips section at the end. And if anyone has questions after everything, they could also ask me then. All right. First, for anyone who's not aware of like what engagement actually is, if they think this is such a vague term that no one really explains, engagement, strictly speaking, is any and all attempts that you try to interact with opponent material. So rather than just saying what you want to say, you're also thinking about your opponent, right? Anything that is unengaging is basically something that you're just stuck in your version of the world. This is very good for showing the judge that you're critically thinking about what the opponent is saying, that you're really trying to engage with their content in a very like well-mannered and like good faith way. And it is generally a very good strategy when you are facing extremely good debaters as well, because every debater has a flaw. And if you are able to engage with that flaw in a very persuasive way, you can beat them as well. All right. The way I view engagement is, as the title of this lecture hint, in two ways, the explicit and implicit engagement. Explicit engagement are things that often get labeled as engagement, like when you do rebuttals, when you do POIs, when you have strategic callouts. And the other type is a little more low-key, which is implicit engagement, where your material is more so compared not by directly attacking what the opponent is saying, but by building it up to be more important than what they are saying, which is still a type of engagement because you're acknowledging what your opponent is saying. You're just trying to work around to explain why, even if that is the case, you still have strong material in any ways. And those two usually fall into comparatives and weighing. They have a lot of overlap. I'll talk a little bit about how I see these differences. For some people, this may be like literally the same thing, but generally, these are two elements of your speech that, once improved, are able to engage with opponent material as well. All right. Why do I make this distinction? The first is that some people are better at some forms of engagement than others. Anyone who's debated against me or has seen me debate knows that I use a lot more implicit engagement than direct rebuttals. This is partially because despite the accent, I'm ESL and I have a hard time sometimes understanding all of the like specificities of other people. And also because for me, it is just easier to brute force my way through an argument. So I'll just have seven mechanisms that are more comparative and hope that that gets me through, right? Some people are just very good at directly responding and proving that something is incorrect. And that means that they might be more willing to do explicit engagement and better at doing it than to, like, for instance, do more direct comparatives. The second reason I make the distinction is because judges credit both of these. They should be, right, if they're a good judge. And if you are able to understand the full method of engaging, you should be able to present this to a judge in a way that they would still credit you as engaging, no matter if you're doing implicit or explicit. But it is good to, directly call the comparative an engagement, because then I think that anyone who's looking into judging will know that this is something that still counts as engagement. And thirdly, just in general in debate, if you know what you're doing and you can label it and you can discuss it from a strategic lens, it adds a lot of intentionality to your speech. So you're now able to think, for instance, okay, I feel like my comparative was weaker, so I want to engage on the comparative better next round. And that gives you like more specific action items for your own personal training and development. So that's why I like to have all these subcategories. It just clears things up in my mind in general. All right, so starting with explicit engagement, I'm just going to go through all the different types, different approaches that you could have to these and what makes each type strong. So rebuttals are the most classic form of engagement. This is most commonly seen as direct responses, explaining why your opponent is wrong, unimportant, or if you're trying to do a flip, why whatever they're saying is applicable to your side as well. All of these are direct responses to whatever it is that they are saying. Usually in the Asian circuit, this is framed as your own part of the speech. So you would say like moving on to my rebuttals, and then you would have like a block of rebuttals. Keep in mind, in other circuits, this is not necessarily the norm. I recently went to the World's University Debate Championship where you see every style of debate that you can imagine, and not everyone does this. So if you are going to be debating against other circuits, keep that in mind that they don't always label their rebuttals in their own sections. Sometimes they incorporate them throughout. So just any type of direct response to another claim is a type of rebuttal, even if it is outside of the segment called rebuttals. What makes a rebuttal actually good and strong then? I think generally there's three elements that make a strong rebuttal. The first is if they prove whatever the claim they are targeting is untrue. The easiest way to do this is to point out to either intuition checks, like just what do you think is more realistic, or doing really rigorous analysis. This is kind of the brute force that I was mentioning before, where the opponent makes a claim, and then what you do in response is just say, okay, this is untrue for three reasons. They give you one reason, so mathematically we beat them out, right? That's also a way to prove that a claim is untrue. The second part of a strong rebuttal is sometimes you want to prove that the opposite is true, where if, for instance, you want the end impact of an opponent argument, and we'll look at some example in a second, you can try and just say, okay, well, if this is what you want to happen, but the other thing happens, then you get actually a harm, and therefore we get to co-opt a benefit in a different way. Basically, you can try and achieve the same impact in a different way, or you prove that the opposite is true. Commonly, this is known as the flip, and this is quite useful for when you don't really have a way of proving that what they're saying is untrue per se, like necessarily, but that what they are claiming could also be true under your side, or perhaps more true under your side. And the third element of a really strong rebuttal is if you just show that the claim is irrelevant, if you cannot prove that it is untrue, if you cannot do the flip, then you could just say, like, okay, even if you believe this. I see a lot of debaters kind of resorting to even if as their first rebuttal. I think that this is fine, but generally, if you want to be really good at engagement, you want to try one or two of these at the same time, just in case the judge doesn't buy your first line of response or your first line of defense, right? So if you're able to say like this is untrue, secondly, even if this is true, and then moving from there. And then you also just seem like you're even more critically engaging with the other team, which helps boost your speaks and like make you look more engaged and therefore more likely to win the debate. So, for example, let's say you're debating a motion like this House regrets the rise of political centrism, where more and more people want to become more close to the center. There's more stigma against being extremist. I don't know if this is a real rise, but this is a real motion. So, assuming that the rise does indeed exist in the status quo, governments would say, okay, well, the counterfactual is better because minorities are silenced in the status quo. So it would be better to be in a world without political centrism because they could express their opinions more. Minorities, especially like gender and racial minorities, often have more extremist views about how society should change because they demand more extremist change. And therefore, like, if we have more political centrism, these minorities don't get a voice. Opposition can respond in various ways. I think a good rebuttal probably looks something like having these three elements. First is to say that this is often not true. Minorities often do support centrism, maybe due to things like, I don't know, acceptability politics, wanting to, fit in with the majority. Maybe minorities don't support centrism because often support centrism, sorry, because they feel like this is the easiest way to bridge over gaps with other people, or that this is the most realistic way of achieving change. You could also try, secondly, a flip to say that likely voices are more easily amplified in the status quo when you have centrism, because people, for instance, take them more seriously. They don't brush them aside. There isn't as much stigma against them because most people agree that, like, the norm should be that we are all more centrist. And the third line of response would be to say, okay, even if it is true that they are silenced, they are more likely to be safe, which is a more like direct or better impact because even if under government side of the house they're able to speak out, that could also directly lead to more danger. So what is better is to maybe like sometimes not speak and be more in line with the rise of political centrism, but in return get a guarantee of safety because there's just less extremism happening on both sides of the political spectrum. All three together would be a really strong way of directly engaging with the main premise or the main claim that government is making. When you are finding these rebuttals, I recommend writing down not every single part of the argument, mostly because in KIDA we are an EFL ESL heavy circuit, and it would be very difficult to both listen and write down every single thing. I think it is strategically smarter to prioritize listening and finding the central premise and then trying to respond to that rather than to specific points within the analysis, because then you're able to generate just more holistic rebuttals altogether. The second type of explicit engagement are points of information. For those who are unfamiliar, these are short interjections that are 15 seconds or less into your opponent's speeches that should benefit your case or harm theirs, or ideally do both. Sometimes people use points of information for other purposes, like they want to disrupt whoever is talking, like maybe they're really on a roll. Maybe they want to just waste their time. At Worlds, I saw people just rage baiting with POIs, like just asking very like controversial questions, trying to get the speaker flustered. If it works, great way of wasting time. I do not recommend using these for other purposes, but this is something that I feel people should be aware of as an option if that is something that you're interested in. These POIs, in all formats but Australs, I think are super powerful and very beneficial, especially in BP debating, especially if you are on the diagonal. So if you are OG, you want to make sure you're POIing CO. If you're OO, you want to POI CG, and vice versa, because this is probably your only way of engaging with the material, especially if you're an opening team towards your diagonal. But also from closing teams to try and give a chance to opening teams to engage with your material so you can get away with more stuff later on. There's a lot of benefits to asking POIs. A strong POI usually will attack a premise in the case rather than a specific mechanism. I've seen many rounds where a debater will say, oh, what you just said is not true. But then if that's the POI, then this specific mechanism could probably be filled in by the next speaker or could be improvised by a competent speaker currently giving their speech. So a specific mechanism falling is not as critical as a premise of the whole case or full claim being called into question. A strong POI will also often force a comparative response to say why something exclusively happens under one side of the house versus another. That's how you know that you're definitely shaking them. If it takes them more than 5 seconds to respond to a POI, you're probably forcing them to try and think of something exclusive about whatever it is that they are saying. A strong POI can also push a burden onto your opponent, basically trying to challenge them to prove additional things that they have not yet proven, to say, like, maybe what you're saying is true, but you also need to prove this and this and this. Why is this also true? And then now the opponent has to go the extra mile to fill in this additional burden. This is typically quite difficult to do on the fly and probably gets pushed down into the next speech. Maybe if the next speaker caught it, like, it's very smart strategically to try and get the other team off their balance as much as possible. And it should highlight your own material when possible. I think a really strong POI will have all of these, but if you have to prioritize, I think any burden push or comparative response is probably going to be the one that takes the most amount of time out of their speech and also helps you seem more engaging and probably also sway the judge more towards being critical of the opponent's case. You basically, the goal of doing a POI, you basically want to get the judge to question the other team's completeness of their case. And there's many different ways to do this. We'll look at an example in a second, but generally you want to make sure that you're attacking it whenever possible. When responding to POIs, also a form of engagement, taking a POIs make you look very engaged. A strong POI response will also often have a couple of things. You should always immediately neutralize the most destructive claim within the POI. There's a lot of habits that I noticed, specifically in the Northeast Asian circuit, of saying yes, but, like, kind of accepting the POI. Oh, maybe what you're saying is true. I think that saying, no, I don't think that, is just stronger. Oh, that should say stronger. Because you generally just have a more direct instinct of saying, no, you're wrong. And then the completion of that statement will probably save you a lot of time. Whereas if you say, yes, maybe this is true, but then also, and then you have to try and come up with weighing on the spot, that can be a bit destructive to your case because you're conceding something to the other team. Even if you're not actually saying, yes, that is true, even if you're saying, yes, that could be true, you're giving them a bit of leeway. Instead, having the immediate instinct to neutralize the claim, that gives you a better chance of flipping whatever they are saying and making it not important or making this attempt at engagement from their side fail. A strong POI response will also typically be quite quick and memorable. When I say memorable, I don't necessarily mean you have to be like the funniest person in the room, but you do have to have a response that is very decisive, that the judge will feel completed the this exchange, right? Because they ask you a POI and then you complete the exchange by responding to it in a strong, memorable way. That's how you can stay memorable. And when I say be quick, I don't mean like brush it aside. That is something that often you shouldn't do, but I just mean that typically responding to a POI, it is only 15 seconds. They're not pushing a bunch of analysis into that 15 seconds, so it shouldn't take more than 15 to 20 seconds to respond as well. And this is something that I've utilized a lot. Like when somebody says, "Oh, but it could also be true that this thing happens," you could just say, "Okay, well, that's assertive. You had to explain that in your speech because you didn't do that. I will just tell you that it is not true and move on." Right? I've been victim of this as well, where I ask an assertive POI and then that's the response. But sometimes you just got to neutralize it as fast as possible and be quick in that way. And a strong POI response could also push a burden onto your opponents. So what I did earlier, just the example now, is, oh, you should have proven that, or you need to prove that, is usually a very good way of putting them on the back foot, making the other team think about, like, okay, how do I actually make sure that my POI response is incorporated in my case. The only time this is not relevant is if they're POIing you about material that they already had that you did not respond to. In that case, you should take time to respond to that material, either by outweighing it or by directly rebutting it. But that's basically the only exception. Any new material POI should require a burden from your opponents, and most POIs, I feel, these days in the meta are more new material POIs than they are necessarily like highlighting your own material. An example of this is an example from a debate that I did during the lead up to Worlds, which I thought was really funny. We did this really funny motion. This also believes that the BCCI, which is like the Big Cricket Organization, that doesn't stand for Big Cricket Organizations, but the Big Cricket Organization in India should prioritize investment into elite women's cricket over regional women's cricket. This was a BP round and we were CG. Our case was just saying that when you invest regionally, you create more tension between the community because oftentimes like men feel like they are that they are wronged, that they're not getting this funding from the BCCI, that this is unfair. And you get more tension locally because these teams tend to like flop a lot more, and therefore it feels even more unfair, whereas an elite team is likely to succeed. And thus, it creates a lot of danger for these local, regional women's players who are actually more accessible to the average fan because they live more regionally, they're more spread out, they are more in numbers, so you cannot protect them with as much finances, and these average fans might harm them. OOPOI'd us to say, oh, but if you invest in them, you can get them better training times in the day or light for their field when it's dark. And my response was to say that I don't think people only harm women at night. So even if this is true, which you did not prove that it is true, that this investment will go to better training, that this harm that you're saying is prevented because probably it still happens in other means, right? My instinct here was to just neutralize the biggest claim. Their claim was to say, but women won't get harmed. So the instinct should be, yes, they will still be, or to just say, whatever it is that you are saying shouldn't stand. And this type of like more aggressive instinct tends to be more successful in getting the judge on your side because you're now able to show them, like, okay, I don't agree with what you're saying directly, and here is why. And when you're able to provide this type of justification, the judge is more likely to agree that this was an unreasonable POI or that the POI failed in doing its rebuttal work or whatever it was trying to do. All right, next are strategic callouts. Strategic callouts are slightly different from rebuttals. They're just observations about opponent failures. In Australs or AP, doing callouts in reply is extremely powerful because it is not technically considered a rebuttal. It is more an observation that a judge could make during oral adjudication. For example, say in the motion, this House would implement 100% inheritance tax in Korea, government might try to say, oh, we'll allow some inheritance after evaluation. This is clearly a squirrel of the motion, so you should call that out. And if it's called out, obviously, down the bench, then it makes government team obviously look very bad. It's a good engagement with their material because you're saying, okay, we heard your material. Here's why you shouldn't credit it. And it also makes your team seem a lot more strategic and more responsive. If you let them get away with this, right, then the judge will have to credit it to a degree, right? Even if they don't believe it, they have to acknowledge that you failed to do the job of engaging. So that's where callouts are very beneficial. There are a lot of different types of callouts. The most common ones that I could think of from the top of my head are to say, first, that something is not exclusive or that something is uncomparative. I picked this up from another debater in KIDA, which is just when you say, okay, this claim that you made is it could be valid, maybe, but you do not prove why this claim only applies to our side of the house. And for instance, in a lot of like minority debates, people like to say that harm happens or doesn't happen to minorities. But the question is, if a harm happens under one side, does it also happen under your side? And if something could be, then it is uncomparative to say that it only happens under one side. Similarly, if an impact is non-exclusive, it means that it could possibly also happen under your side with other reasons. These types of callouts are very useful in proving that a certain benefit does or does not accrue. For instance, recently we did a motion about whether parents should like inflate their children's expectations. And government said like, oh, you can learn from failure when you do not inflate their expectations, and when they learn from failure, they become stronger. And the call out to that was just to say, okay, but learning from failure is non-exclusive. Probably you learn from failure regardless under both sides of the house when you experience failure. The question is, how is the approach to dealing with that failure? How is that different with your parents supporting you and inflating your expectations versus not? Is it that now you feel disappointed, but at least you bond with your parents? Or is it that your parents actively tell you that you can't do something, and therefore when you fail, it feels 100 times worse? So the impact actually was not necessarily exclusive. It could happen on both sides, and then you create a tipping point of a harm that does happen on the other side. If you're doing reply, you can just point this out through a call out and to point out to previous analysis to explain why a certain benefit still, unique benefit still happens under your side of the house, because you do want to try and build up like exclusivity as much as possible. The second common call out is to say something is vague or undercharacterized. We don't know what this looks like. This often happens in like narrative debates or in, niche actor debates, which is when you talk about something that most people don't know a lot about. This is a good call out because if you do have characterization under your side of the house and you do provide some explanation for why it's more likely, then you can say, okay, well, under their side, it's very vague, whereas we tell you, and then you have like a laundry list of better engagements. Another common call out that you probably hear more often, I think, than all the other ones is when somebody is under mechanized or under explained. This is just meaning that there are not enough reasons for why what you are saying is true, is actually true. Like there isn't enough explanation. When you criticize an opponent for being under mechanized, I have to note you have to be more mechanized than they are to make this call out. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Otherwise, it just seems like throwing stones from a glass building, right? To use that phrase. So it's important when you point out something is under mechanized to first of all explain what burdens were missed, and secondly, why those burdens were not missed under your side of the house. So, for instance, in a super classic like kids motion, when I coach my kids, I always give them the "this house would ban homework" motion, and I get to be opposition, which I always love because I have to assign them homework. And on government, they always go, oh, but students are so stressed. So when you ban homework, they will be less stressed. And I think, I got you. So then on opposition, what I just say is like, okay, well, you don't explain actually how banning homework decreases stress. You didn't provide that link. There isn't mech to explain why the existence of homework is the, first of all, sole reason that you have stress. And secondly, the removal of it is going to actually lead to less stress. And then, you do the 1-2, you say, it could be the case that when you ban homework, for example, you get more stressed because you have less practice. So then the next time you have an exam and you're underprepared and you fail, that makes you feel much worse than it would have if you were just like, ugh, I'm a little bummed that I have to do homework today. And that is only possible if you criticize the missing links or the missing mechanisms within an opponent's argument. The fourth most common call out is when somebody is squirreling or when they are irrelevant to the motion. Squirreling specifically means if they are kind of trying to debate their way around the motion, like if they use a lot of big jargon, or if they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, and kind of having a soft stance, not really taking the trade-off as it's supposed to be, or if they're misinterpreting the motion in a very uncharitable way. It's a really good call out because the judge probably also doesn't want to see that kind of debate. So it's just beneficial to your team to seem like you're actually trying to do the real trade-off, and it makes the other team look bad. Similar to squirreling, if somebody is irrelevant to the motion, if they're debating a different motion type, if they're doing like a banning motion for a regrets motion, then explaining why an argument is irrelevant is a very good and quick way of getting rid of that contribution within the debate. Other callouts, this is less likely, I think, these days. People try to listen more. But straw manning, when they present your argument as not exactly what you said, I think specifically like more inexperienced debaters do this, where they kind of take the weak version of the claim and present that as the actual claim, calling that out and saying like, here's what we actually said. It makes them look bad generally. You should also trust the judge that they actually did take notes, but it's good to make sure that you're reminding them of what the argument is just in case. Similarly, cherry picking, where they just choose what is convenient about the argument to respond to, that is also a good call out typically because you can just say, well, they're not engaging to the full argument, they're only picking the certain elements that they want to engage to. Um, and that is why they shouldn't be able to win. The other call out is to say that they are unengaging. I don't think this is often a problem these days. I think that many people take POIs and do rebuttals, but to say unengaging could also mean that they are not actually addressing or taking your material head on, and rather just like building their own material. So if they're not being responsive and just being constructive, that could be an unengaging team. And the harm of being unengaging is that they're not actually explaining why their side is better than yours. They're just explaining how their side exists or looks like. Right. So a lack of engagement could also be a common call out. These are the ones that I tend to default to. I'm sure there are others that could be relevant, but I feel like these are the ones that being familiar with and getting comfortable with is best. Yes, it is sometimes a bit of like a mean move to pull out a call out and be like, oh, you were under mechanized. Like, who are you to tell me that? But it is necessary because you are trying to find and poke holes in the opponent as much as you can. Okay. When you make call outs, I tend to do very simple, like format, which is to identify whatever the claim is, criticize it for whatever the flaw was, and then explains why it loses the debate. For example, like Elo made the claim that something happened, but this is an uncomparative claim because of this and this and this, meaning you should believe that the same can be true under our side. This is a good call out. You just say it's uncomparative. You explain why it is uncomparative. And then you say, okay, you should believe this and this and this. So just kind of like wrap it all up together. This is what a call out typically looks like. It is similar in structure to a rebuttal. It often gets lumped together with a rebuttal. I like to just have my whole section of like responses and rebuttals in one and incorporate callouts and rebuttals together. But it is very useful to making sure that you're not letting your opponent get away with things that they shouldn't be getting away with by the rules of debate. All right, implicit engagement then. This is the more fun thing. This is my specialty. I don't tend to do as much explicit engagement just because I, first of all, find it a bit scary. And secondly, as I mentioned before, I'm not the best listener in the world. So implicit engagement is my forte. This is like my comfortability. And if you are like me and you like building more than you like responding, probably these are the types of engagements that you will end up doing. The first is a comparative. Comparative uh, basically just means like how the two sides differ, right? This is generally what this means. When people refer to the comparative, they're talking about the difference, but they use the word comparative instead. It's an EPL trend that trickled down. And debate itself is all about the comparative. It's all about comparing not just why something is true, but why something is better than the other side. Right? That should always be your goal. I think especially rookies tend to fixate on proving that a claim is true rather than proving that a claim is true and better. If a claim is true but not better than the other claim, then you just lose because the other team just has a better claim. If your claim is true and you're fighting to prove that it is true, then you have a much higher chance of actually defeating your opponent. For example, this is a very classic motion. This house prefers strong dictatorships over weak democracies. The delta, or the point of change in the debate, is whether it is better to have freedom at the cost of efficiency in government, or whether efficiency in government at the cost of freedom is better. So when you understand this comparative, when you understand what is different under each side, you're able to create a unique advantage in your mechanism. So, for instance, in this motion, government probably talks about how being able to run a country, being able to get things to your citizens, being able to protect your citizens, provide them with utilities and whatnot, this is the most important thing. This is the baseline necessity for all other self-actualization. And that is why you need to have a strong government, even if that government doesn't allow for any dissent. And probably they would have to explain why a dictatorship being strong, like why the strength is the most important thing in the debate. Whereas opposition, they probably want to explain why democracy or the freedom of speech and engagement is the most important part of the debate. Explaining maybe why, even if there are governmental inefficiencies, if you're unable to speak out against the government, it is much more likely to be corrupt, it hurts the most vulnerable, it is unsustainable, etc., right? So whatever the unique advantage of your team is, you should be using that within an argument. And that is already a way of engaging with the other material by explaining that whatever it is that your side has that their side does not creates a positive change. It is super important that the advantage that your team has is unique rather than just an advantage, because otherwise they will be co-opting it later on. The other type of implicit engagement is weighing. Weighing is just giving reasons why what you're saying is important. This implicitly explains why your opponent's material is less important. You could also explicitly say that it is less important, but weighing is generally seen as a way of talking about the other side's material without directly calling it out. So a good example of this, for instance, is this house supports the rise of social media as a primary source of news. Opposition is probably going to talk about, oh, we don't support this because it will lead to rampant misinformation. And then they probably need to think about why rampant misinformation is the most important topic when government is going to talk about all these wonderful things like accessibility, democratization of news, etc., etc. So to engage with that material, opposition needs to explain why rampant misinformation doesn't just exist and is important, but why it is more important than other types of impacts. This is where you use like the common debate metrics like scale, long-term harm, etc. But I think that the better way to think about this rather than just as a formula is to think about what about this impact is uniquely better than the other impacts? So things, for instance, like democratization, like accessibility, you could say things like both of those things could exist, but they are less of an important impact because they are more easily like poisoned by misinformation, which means that even if they exist, they don't actually yield positive results over a long period of time. Whereas misinformation could actively cause harm, and therefore it is the most important impact. It is more urgent, it is more big in scale, etc., etc. What I see a lot is in terms of reversibility, whether something can be undone or not. I've seen this as maybe a bit more of a growing trend of explaining why a certain impact being more important is because specifically you cannot undo it later on. Generally, though, when you're choosing your method of weighing, which I think is the thing people struggle with most in weighing, the easiest thing to think about is what is a feature of your impact that does not exist on the other side. So, for example, government, when they talk about accessibility and how this helps the most vulnerable access news, um, because social media is free and whatnot, so this opens up an avenue for poor people, then what they have is that they're caring about vulnerable people. Maybe they're not caring about the majority of people because for most people, they still have access to news, even without social media being the primary source. So opposition could probably talk about how this is marginal in terms of benefit, whereas misinformation would be a new thing that happens on social media because of social media specifically being the tipping point, and therefore this would be more important than the impact on accessibility, just as an example. But generally, when you're thinking about weighing, the intuitive analysis of the characteristic of the impact versus the characteristic of the other impact could be a good way of like formalizing this type of weighing or selection in your mind. Okay. Finally, some other tips on the mindset you should have when responding. The first, you should flag your engagements whenever possible, using terms like, comparatively or to weigh this against the opponent material when you are flagging, doing rebuttals or callouts. This is just for judges like note taking. You have to remember that judges are people too. They also get tired, they get distracted, they get confused if you are being unclear. Like they're not robots who are just transcribing what you're saying. They're trying to understand what you are saying. So being very clear, having a big emphasis on making sure that you're like signposting or explaining, labeling whatever it is that you are doing will generally benefit you in getting credited more. Secondly, don't waste POIs, don't waste rebuttals on marginal things. Even if what they just said, like the material they just gave, is untrue. Oh, they just gave an example that was so stupid. Oh, I'm going to get them via a POI. Resist the urge. It's not going to be worth it. You want to save up your POIs and rebuttals for the most important parts of the debate because you only have 7 minutes, 7:15, right? And that means that you have to be very careful about what you spend time on. If you spend too much time on marginal examples or things that are easily replaceable by the other teams, like a minor mechanism, then you're wasting your own time and giving them the opportunity to look even better when they rebuild it in the next speaker. Thirdly, being funny is fine when you are engaging. Being too dismissive as humor is dangerous for your team. So you could say things like, this is ridiculous, but you have to explain why it is ridiculous. You have to be like, I've heard people say a lot of different phrases when they talk about other teams. They'll be like, I do not understand if they were in this debate, or maybe they were not listening, or maybe their heads were in the sand. You hear a lot of these like funny little quips. It's not enough to say the quip, you have to actually analyze it, because if you're just being funny but dismissive, that makes you not look good, first of all, to the judge, but also you're just wasting your time because just saying that, oh, they weren't paying attention doesn't actually engage to what the other team is saying. So keep in mind that there is a balance here. Sometimes you do need to be dismissive. Like, to be honest, if you're meeting someone who just ran an insane case and it's like legitimately crazy, then you can say that that was a legitimately crazy case and explain why. But even in that case, there's always a need for actual explanations, because if you don't, if you just rely on brute forcing your way through, then you're less likely to win because you're not actually creating a margin and you don't know what the judge is thinking and whether they're believing your opponent. So you always want to hedge your bets. And also it would make your opponent feel kind of bad if you're just like, that was a stupid argument, moving on. especially if they put a lot of work into that. So generally, I would say people are making decent arguments, and you should make a good attempt at engaging to them and not being dismissive. Fourthly, if you, like me, struggle with listening, either because of like a language problem or whatever else it may be, maybe you watch a lot of short form content and your attention span is cooked, sometimes it is better to prioritize holistic engagement versus specific engagement. When I say holistic engagement, I mean just talking about the general claims that they are making rather than the specifics little parts that they are talking about. And when you do this type of holistic engagement, when you talk about the overall goal of the other team's case, you seem like you're really engaging with them in a very good way, but you don't have to use as much of your brain power on listening because you just need to get the main idea. Obviously, I do suggest that if you can actively listen and if you want to be better at engagement, you should actively listen. But while you are building that skill, don't be afraid to instead think about how you can holistically engage with something instead if you're unable to directly respond to absolutely everything that they are saying. And fifthly, and I think this is actually the most important tip in this entire lecture, when you're in doubt, when you're not sure about whether you're engaging in the correct way or whether the other team is being persuasive or what, just assume that the other team is right and go from there. This is also sometimes called like steel manning as opposed to straw manning, where you make the other team's case for them. You assume that they have the strongest version of the argument, that they did all of their burdens, that they fulfilled absolutely everything that they wanted to say to the maximum. If you assume this, you're going to have higher quality engagement because you're able to, if you missed anything, make sure that you seem like you didn't and create margins. Some people call this, and I don't know if I agree with this term, shadow boxing, when you kind of like fight against an opponent that isn't there, but you create the opponent for you. This is in the case that you think, oh, I don't think they really have a case. You should still be attempting to engage because you don't know if they don't have a case. You know, crazier things have happened. There have been upsets before. And even if a speaker, for instance, and I think this happens a lot in like EFL circuits where people assume that EFL teams are not actually proving things, but they're not actually listening, that's when you start losing to those teams and then you become shocked. So, in order to avoid those instances, just assume that the other team is right and start from there. Assume that what they're saying is somewhat proven and that their claim makes sense and is relevant, and then move from there and choose the way that you want to engage with that. The last thing I'll say before opening up for any questions is in terms of choosing or incorporating this type of engagement into your own speeches. This is super dependent on each debater. I'm not going to tell you what the best way for you personally to engage because each person views their own speech in different ways. They have their own strengths. But generally, when you're trying to incorporate this type of like I'm saying the word engagement a million times, this type of engagement, you really want to prioritize making the debate as clear as possible and creating the differences between you and your opponent as much as possible. Anything that muddies the water is going to make the debate hellish for an average judge to adjudicate. And if you clarify things, even if you're a bit clumsy about it, throughout explaining like what is different between your teams, why the other team is being, non-exclusive, et cetera, et cetera. If you're just clarifying these things and making the debate more of like a clear-cut debate, you're going to see, I think, better results. And that should always be the mindset that you're using engagement for, clarifying your team stance, the other team stance, and the debate as a whole. All right, that's all the material that I had prepared. I will now, if anyone has any questions, you could ask, but if not, we'll wrap up soon. I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments or anything like that. I don't think I got any messages either. You can also reach out to me in other ways. I'm very searchable on Instagram, I found out recently. And like if you're in KIDA, I'm sure someone in your society has my phone number. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or need any tips or anything like that. Yeah, and thank you so much for listening to the lecture. I'll stop the recording now.
Well, might as well have one question, just
Oh,
just for
yes.
the sake of a question.
Yes, Peter.
So you mentioned early in your talk that at Worlds you saw a lot of different ways of organizing speeches and organizing engagements. Any particular way that stood out, or any like team that you thought like, wow, that's a really interesting way of incorporating their engagement or something?
Mm. I think the way Australians debate is so interesting to me because they talk almost in like stories. They don't go like, here's my first argument, here's the impact. They just start almost like having a conversation about what they think is the most important thing. So they present it as like, here is a problem that we need to solve, and here are the ways that we solve the problem, and here's why we solve it better than the other side, right? But the way that they do it is not as structured as I would say in the Asian circuit, and as a result, they're a bit harder to track. But that also means that the ways that they're engaging are a lot more implicit. So instead of like directly saying that you're wrong, they'll instead spend a lot of time explaining why their side is the most right, essentially, which I thought is very interesting. And also, a lot of the Balkan debaters are very like direct and simple with their responsive. They'll be like, first of all, you said this. This is not true because of this reason. Moving on. Like they don't spend a lot of time doing flowery language, which is why like you have very different norms of what's explicit and implicit. I think in Korea you see a lot more explicit responses than you would in other circuits, which I think is quite interesting as well. Yeah. All right. All right, now I can stop the recording, I think.